coming off a season with 340 carries and 53 catches and over 2,000 total yards. A tremendous year for Josh Jacobs. Why is he on your bust list, Dave?
I have a hard time believing he's going to repeat what he did last year, especially after studying his body of work. I've talked about this before. He averaged anywhere from 14.1 to 14.3 PPR points per game in 2021, 2020, and 2019. His rushing metrics were off the charts last year. He did a great job. You can talk about his YPC, his yards after contact. They were all way, way up from where he was in 2021. You might say, okay, well, he was playing for a contract and now he's doing it again because I got franchise tag. That's true, but he's a year older. You might say, and this might be the case for him, is it's Josh McDaniels. And Josh McDaniels gave him all kinds of opportunities and ran a scheme that really worked well for him. And you can bank on it again. That might be a good case for Josh Jacobs. I'm just going to say that it's more likely, based on what we've seen over the last 4 years, that he'll settle in around 15 PPR points per game rather than 19 PPR points per game. And so I'm not particularly interested in taking him as a top 6 or 7 type of fantasy running back. Maybe late round 2, you could talk me into taking Josh Jacobs if he's still there. But I think someone's going to take him before then. I think he'll end up being a top 20 pick because of what he did last year.
I'm looking at Fantasy Pros consensus rankings. I don't know who's in this. It's 17 experts. And Jacobs is RB6. It's McCaffrey, Taylor, Eckler, Barkley, Ken Walker, Josh Jacobs. So you think that's too rich?
Too rich.
Okay. Jamie, what about you? Do you share this sentiment on Josh Jacobs?
Yes and no. I think 6 is to me, that's the high end of it, of where he's going to be probably ranked, probably drafted in terms of running backs off the board. The thing I think that's going to come down to is, I don't have a problem middle of the second round. I think if he's a first round pick, then he's a bust. But I do think that some of the things Dave said are still going to carry over for this year. I think the fact that he stayed healthy is a big part of it. He played a lot of games in his first 3-4 seasons, not healthy. And, that's to his credit. He played through a shoulder injury, played through some lower leg injuries. And his production suffered as a result of that. And we don't know how healthy he was at any point. Maybe the same thing was the case last year. He just was gutting it out because of the contract situation. But the fact that he got the amount of work that he did with a new coach, I think you got to say that that's the most encouraging thing from what came out of last season. And then he just put the production on top of it. So the fact that he still got the motivation for a new deal, the fact that the team is still going to be committed to him, I don't think they're going to all of a sudden turn to Zamir White and make more out of whatever's there in their backfield. It feels like it's still going to be his job and his job to, carry the offense. 50 catches is probably unrealistic, so I still put him closer to, probably 40 as a ceiling. But I do think that based on what this team looks like and what this coaching staff has put on him and what his ability is, we've always said that he was capable of more. And I think he finally showed it last year. So I don't think he's going to be a 19 point per game type of guy. I would probably bank it around 17. So again, if you're taking him mid to end of round 2, I think it's perfect. If he's going ahead of that, then yes, I think he's a bust. But 15th overall, to me, feels like a good landing spot for him.
All right. Look, I brought this up before with him. This is a very simplistic way to look at Josh Jacobs and his production. It's just going to be 2 numbers here. It's going to be his yards per carry in 4 seasons. And here they are. 4.8, 3.9, 4.0, 4.9. 2 great seasons, 2 pretty, I think 3.9, 4.0 is pretty bad. And then here is the Pro Football Focus run blocking grade for the Raiders in those 4 seasons. 18th, 26th, 29th, 17th. If you notice the correlation there, when he's had an average offensive or average run blocking team, he's averaged close to 5 yards per carry. When it's been one of the worst, it's been 4 yards per carry. Maybe that's all it is. Maybe he's just played behind terrible offensive lines in 2 of his careers, and that's why he was so inefficient. I don't know, but it actually does feel like, while simplistic, feels like a fairly plausible explanation. And it was an offensive line that certainly overachieved last year. All right. Can you buy that argument, Dave?
I would actually say that I don't think the offensive line gets worse. I think they started so many guys last year that maybe had less experience than we would have liked, or less to like about them, and they ended up playing pretty well. So it wouldn't surprise me if they were a middle of the pack offensive line again.
Okay. Let's go to a mutual bust running back here. You guys both have Javonte Williams on your bust list. Jamie, what round does he go in that you say, okay, that's too early, he's a bust? Javonte Williams.
We just saw it. I mean, round 2. So if anybody's valuing that high, that's clearly way too soon. I think even round 3 is probably a little bit risky, and it might, when we start to get to closer to August, round 4 might be too risky. So, just the concern over his health at this point is the biggest thing. I think if he is healthy, he has a chance to maybe exceed his average draft position if it falls to the right spot. But I think anything in the first 3 rounds for Javonte Williams right now is just too soon. So I'm hoping he's going to be 100%. It's a pretty devastating knee injury that he suffered. I know there's been some, why are we, or I'll speak for myself, why am I high on Breece Hall and not so much on Javonte Williams? I think the knee injuries are different. And Hall seems to be recovering a little bit faster and a little bit better than Javonte Williams at this point, just based on the reports and what the social media posts have been. So I feel more comfortable with him. But I think, Javonte is probably somebody that has a lot to prove before we can say he's back to being worthy of a top 36 overall pick.
Dave Richard.
I have him ranked 28th among running backs and would not take him until round 6.
Wow.
I am very nervous about how effective he'll be even when he does come back. It sounds like they're in love with Samaje Perine in Denver. The fact that they went out and chose him to be their guy to replace Javonte Williams until Javonte's ready, and then guy to share with Javonte Williams while Javonte Williams ramps up. What's the runway look like for him to be the feature back for Denver? And I want him to be the feature back for Denver. That's an offensive line that should take a step forward this year. You've always seen offensive lines play well under Sean Payton and certainly be a priority under Sean Payton. And we've seen running backs catch a ton of footballs under Sean Payton. Well, Perine's specialty when he wasn't the every down back in Cincy was playing on passing downs. So I think that role is out for Javonte Williams in 2023. That kills the upside of him finishing as a top 12 type of fantasy running back. Now it's a matter of what can he do on limited work while he's still working his way back from an ACL injury that seems to not be progressing as fast as others around the league. And that just makes me want to head for the hills on Javonte Williams. Let somebody else take him. I'm curious where he is in Fantasy Pros and their early
ADP. He is RB29, looks like.
Okay, so he's right around where I'd have him.
These are rankings, not
right.
Yeah. Right behind Alvin Kamara, who's another guy we're going to talk about a little bit later. I haven't gone through every year of Sean Payton, but I started going through, him with the Saints, and boy, you forget all the splitting. It's just Deuce McAllister and Reggie Bush, Pierre Thomas and Deuce McAllister and Reggie Bush, Pierre Thomas and Mike Bell, Reggie Bush and Aaron Stecker got 115 carries. Bush had 157 and Stecker had 115. Obviously we remember more recently Ingram and Kamara. Jamie, that history, what does that mean to you when you look at the Broncos backfield? Do you think they're going to add someone in the draft maybe with the uncertainty of Javonte Williams? And, can anyone get enough? Well, they get a lot of catches. That's the good thing. They're involved in the passing game, but the workloads, the splitting, what do you think is going to happen there in Denver?
I think a lot of that, though, is somewhat case specific. Reggie Bush was never going to be a featured guy, based on what we saw of his profile. Alvin Kamara really didn't become that until sort of the end of Sean Payton's time there. And then even so, never the true feature type of guy that we like to, look at and talk about. So Javonte certainly feels more of fits more of that profile. But again, Deuce McAllister was sort of that mold. I think you made case Pierre Thomas was in sort of that mold, but again, different pedigrees for those two guys. I think if you told me right now Javonte was 100%, no issues, never had a knee injury, played last year, had a decent season, we'd be looking at him as a top 24 overall pick.
Agreed.
So if he does make I don't want to say miraculous recovery, but makes a strong enough recovery that he's ready to go, training camp, no issues, looks the part, we're going to get excited about him again, and understandably so. And it probably will be to a detriment because he's going to split with Samaje Perine. I don't want to overvalue Samaje Perine. We talked about him on the Sleepers show, and I told you what Sean Payton said at the owners' meetings. The one thing that he said, which kind of stood out, which is kind of lending more toward the Javonte Williams side of things, is he's a guy that's dependable. You know, I forget the exact word that he used, but he said, you know, he said, given our situation, that's important. And so I'm paraphrasing, but Samaje Perine not a very talented NFL running back. He's a good player, but he's not Javonte if Javonte's right. You know, so what I'm getting at is I think if both guys were 100%, I don't think it would be a 50-50 split. I don't think it'd be a 60-40 split. I think it would be Joe Mixon and Samaje Perine. You know, they'd use him as a blocker. They'd use him on some passing down situations. He'd have more stats probably in Denver than he would in Cincinnati, but I don't think Javonte is the type of guy you take off the field for Samaje Perine if they're both 100%.
Looks like the most carries by a Saints running back since 2006. I didn't look at last year. I was just looking at the Sean Payton era, but no way anybody surpassed this last year anyway. Most carries by a Saints running back, I think, is 244 in the Sean Payton era. But Kamara had 240 in 2021, the last year Sean Payton coached, and that was in only, I think, 13 games. So he got a lot of work per game. All right. Anything else to say there, or are we moving on?
Let's move
on. Yeah, let's move on. Let's go to Mike Evans. Yeah, I do feel like people are going to be hesitant to draft Mike Evans. At some point, I wonder if he could become a steal, Dave. What do you think Mike Evans' draft value should be? He's on your bust list.
I think he should be looked at as a number 3 receiver. And a little bit has to do with age and what we saw from him last year and how he kind of took a downturn in production last year. But I think a lot of it has to do with Baker Mayfield, who over the course of his 6 seasons in the NFL, no wide receiver has more than 6 touchdowns from him in a season. And it only happened one time. It was Jarvis Landry in 2019. Only 2 receivers have had over 1,000 yards from him. It was Landry in 2019, OBJ in 2019, that amazing Browns year. Baker's had a bad throw rate north of 17%, not just last year. Each of his last 5 seasons, it's been 17% or more. It's been terrible. Off target rate on throws of 10 to 19 air yards, 20.3%. That's really high. And if you think that's high, listen to this: 20 plus air yards. I don't know why I said yard twice there. 41.4% last year. Only Zach Wilson, Matthew Stafford, Lamar Jackson, and Marcus Mariota were worse. Brady was at 25%. You'll take a 25% off target rate from Baker Mayfield. I think he's a bad fit for what Mike Evans' game is. Evans, all of his touchdowns last year came on go routes. That's a bad route for Baker Mayfield. He's been terrible at it last year. 35.7% completion rate on go routes. It was 38% in 2021. He's just not good at connecting deep, and that's where Mike Evans does plenty of his damage.
Do you think Chris Godwin is also a bust?
Because he works closer to the line of scrimmage and has a lower ADOT, I think he fits in better with what Baker does. I also think he runs a lot of the same type of routes that Baker is actually good at throwing. Mm-hmm. So I'm not quite right. Godwin isn't ranked as high as he normally is for me. I've got Godwin at 25 in full PPR at wide receiver. So I don't know where the consensus is. Maybe that means that he's a bust for me. But I still think there's a chance that he could PPR his way to a decent finish with Baker.
Okay, Mike Evans. Would you take Mike Evans or, the next guy on our list, Christian Kirk? You also have him on your bust list. I know you're high on Calvin Ridley. Would you rather have Mike Evans or Christian Kirk?
As of now, I have Evans ahead of Christian Kirk. But I know that Jamie and Heath are big fans of Christian Kirk. So let's write that one in pencil. And when I get to studying the Jaguars, listen, I'm going to be excited about the Jaguars passing game. If I think there's enough there for Kirk to get more targets than Evans this year, then it's easy to go with Kirk ahead of Evans.
All right, Jamie, how do you feel about these two guys, Evans and Kirk? Both busts?
Not Kirk. I do think Evans has bust potential, but it's, the obvious situation from what a year ago was and Baker. So your question, I thought, was certainly more relevant. That does it get to a point where he falls to a spot? Because I think everybody's going to fear Mike Evans enough that he becomes just a great value. And Dave's right; he's a number 3 receiver. I don't think anybody's going to rank him higher. I'm curious where Fantasy Pros consensus as well. Like if he falls to wide receiver 30. Does he fall past that?
29. 29.
I would say most people will probably have him in that 24 to 30 range. So, when you start to compare him to Christian Kirk and, Terry McLaurin, and, this could be a range for Christian Watson would be my guess, in some people's rankings, Michael Pittman, those type of guys. Format will certainly matter, but, he's still going to command plenty of targets, while they will be worse targets than he's had over the last few years because of the quarterback downgrade from Brady to Baker. He's still hopefully talented enough that age doesn't become too much of an issue. I think just as a number 3 receiver, it's not a bad gamble on what Mike Evans has been. So again, this comes down to what the investment is. To call him a bust, I think is relative to where he's getting drafted.
Yeah, Evans still averaged 75 yards per game last year. That's pretty good.
And you brought this up quite a bit. The pass interference calls. How much that impacted him, how many touchdowns and big plays that he lost on those type of plays.
Yeah.
Part of that is not separating. So he's getting too much in contact with defensive backs is part of it. But we were getting targets from him from a 45-year-old quarterback that was going through a divorce and headed to retirement. So all those things have to factor into.
I just want to credit Chris for bringing that pass interference thing up. That was him. So right now, Fantasy Pros consensus rankings, wide receiver 29 is Evans, wide receiver 28 is Christian Kirk. So, Jamie, you did not agree with this. What is the bust case, by the way, for Christian Kirk, Dave?
The bust case is that he turns into the number 2 target in Jacksonville and maybe even shares that role as being second in targets with others in Jacksonville, because I think Calvin Ridley is going to end up being the number 1. And Kirk did a great job last year, but he had a ton of targets. He shared a lot too. But I just can't imagine him being as good as he was last year.
All right. Yeah, he was wide receiver 20 per game last year. Christian Kirk, he was a terrific draft pick. He ended up being wide receiver 12 overall. He had 7 games with single-digit PPR fantasy points, and they were pretty much all tough matchups. 5 of the 7 games were against teams that were top 6 against wide receivers, but terrific year for Christian Kirk. All right, those are Dave's busts: Evans, Kirk, Javonte, Josh Jacobs, Tua Tagovailoa.
Let me just say one thing about that. I think those tough matchups might tilt a little bit more toward Calvin Ridley now, because if Kirk isn't the number 1, he's never going to see number 1 type coverage. So there might be fewer of those types of games from Christian Kirk. He's a number 3 receiver. He'll have a lot of games in between like 10 and 13 PPR points, and he'll have 4 or 5 weeks where he ends up striking big.
The thing you're hearing out of Jacksonville, especially coming out of the owners' meetings, I still think Kirk leads them in targets. And so he's definitely not going to draw the tougher matchups because of where he's going to line up. He's going to be their slot guy. Jones and Ridley will be on the outside. It's just a matter of, does Ridley have the opportunity to get more catches than Kirk? I would say if everybody's healthy, Kirk leads them in catches, but really should lead them in yards and probably lead them in touchdowns. I'll make the same comparison. I think if you hope for these guys to maximize their potential, you're looking at peak Godwin, peak Mike Evans. Big play receiver on the outside, that's Ridley. Slot guy getting more opportunities, that's Kirk. Trevor Lawrence, Doug Peterson, they love Christian Kirk. They're absolutely in love with this guy. So I don't think he's going away by any stretch just because Calvin Ridley's there. I think where Calvin Ridley is going to make a significant impact, he's going to impact Evan Ingram. He's going to impact Zay Jones. Those 2 players lose the most because Calvin Ridley's on the field. Christian Kirk, I don't think, loses very much.
There's also a handful of targets vacated. Marvin Jones left. That's 81 targets. I don't think Jamal Agnew is going to get 30 targets again. So I think that there's a chance that Christian Kirk easily tops 100 targets, but I think there's a chance that Calvin Ridley gets to like 130, 140.
Yeah, I would say it's probably, if you're going to say who's going to lead them team of targets, I'd say Kirk is probably in the 130 to 140 range, and I would say Ridley's probably 120 to 130.
Right. So you're basically saying that Kirk will repeat what he did. He had 133 targets last year.
I don't think he goes down by any stretch.
Okay. Zay Jones was right behind him with 121. I don't think he's going to get the same.
I don't think he gets anything close to 100.
No. So there's a lot of targets that have to be made up for, even if Kirk stays at 133. I mean, goodness, if you take away half of Zay Jones' targets and then add on Jones and Agnew, you're talking about over 150 targets. You're talking
about a better Trevor Lawrence too.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up. You're focused on the targets, and you should be. Let's also focus on the passing yards. It was something like 4,100. I don't think anyone's going to be surprised if they're at 4,800 this year. They could just be a much better passing offense, and he could average more yards per target.